Episode 65 is the final look at Mac Miller's Faces, a mixtape he released in 2014. This is now part 2 and covers the tracks in the second half of this phenomenal piece. Please remember, these are my thoughts on the symbolisms. Definitely form your own meaning from the lyrics that I mentioned. Diablo, as everyone knows, means the devil in Spanish. He has a nice reference in verse 1 whereby he opposes Eminem's stance as a rap god, calling himself the rap devil. P.T. Pablo is also an American rapper from North Carolina. He had his 2001 song Raise Up Do Well, produced by Timbaland. Fools I Pity Him is funny. It's a reference to Mr. T's I Pity the Fool if you saw his commercials almost a decade ago. Mystery men referenced here also were just some fake superheroes. Mac isn't pretentious. He knows he's not trying to revive hip-hop or a genre or something crazy like that. He's just him all the time. Pete Maravich, aka Pistol Pete, was the man, known as one of the best to do it, playing shooting guard for the Utah Jazz among other teams. As he says here, whether he's actually diagnosed as having insomnia or not, he definitely reminisces a lot while under the influence, as his past tracks have stated, causing him to stay up at night. Again, him being under the influence is causing him to hallucinate and see velociraptors on Saturn. He mentions Davis Love III, who has won 21 events on the PGA Tour and also been top 10 for a significant amount of time. The line "bullets in my cornea" is just an indication his eyes are bloodshot from sleep deprivation or drug use. The song title is referenced here, meaning Hail Mary in Latin, Christian terms. The fact Mac is acknowledging the time of Mardi Gras may be a reference to the fact that people wear masks in it and the like in such festivals, being a metaphor for real life, whereby people often hide their real self in their day-to-days. The double play on mafia of immigrants is an indication of this. For example, they're celebrating like normal people, and yet their real jobs are criminal in nature. While track 15 is an instrumental, the whole mixtape came at a crazy time for him when he was young. I wanted to take this opportunity to take a short break and look at the good that Mac did while he was with us. The Mac Miller Fund he set up supported young musicians in deprived communities, with both resources for exploration in the arts and assisting young 27 and younger with all stages of addiction recovery. His legacy should be rightfully defined by his outsized charisma, selflessness, and commitment to community building. Do note that 55 was also produced by Thundercat, if you couldn't already tell by the bass line and guitar. The main sample on this track came from Raymond Scott, who was an American composer, producer, and was the inventor of electronic instruments as we know it actually. He studied at the best music school in the world, Juilliard. He later started his own research company and helped Bob Moog develop the Moog synthesizer. He was even hired by the father of Motown, Berry Gordy. When he mentions amusement park ride in the first verse, that could be talking about how roller coasters are a representation of the world, going up and down. Everyone's lives go up and down. Mac's a bit blunt in verse 2 with "Suppose I'll die alone" from an overdose of some sort. Yodeling is rapidly fluctuating high-pitched vocals originating from Bavaria, which symbolizes lost beauty. Using those two parts, you could talk about how him passing away is almost lost beauty. Always feeling like a foreigner goes back to René Descartes' theory that the only sure thing in this world is that your thinking exists. Mac also here has a reference to the Nicolas Cage film Lord of War, whereby Vitaly is a character who is a drug addict who dies after trying rehab. LSD is a hallucinogenic, which means it's capable of altering thoughts, feeling, and reality perceptions of the individual who takes it. The intro by Timothy Leary attempts to ask, "Who am I?" which is a timeless philosophical question. He has that line also, "sank to the floor on his ship." I think it's interesting wordplay that is a great metaphor for trips under the influence of LSD. The fact that the passengers escaped might mean that the joy/purpose of what he was doing was over, but he was still trapped in this LSD trip. In the second verse, he has that line about how the world is filled with nothing but greed, devoid of love and passion and hope. While this may be a nihilistic approach to thinking, it's saying in a way how being under the influence has allowed Mac to see the truth about the world and its true meaning. Track 18, Insomniak, has the line, "I don't need your money. You can hold your check." It starts off with a proud, egotistical Mac. He has success, he has money, he doesn't need help from other people. In verse 2, he talks about how chain reactions are happening when he makes a pact, a potential reference to him signing contracts or making moves of some sort. A statement about how whatever decision he makes has consequences in many different areas, whether for example philanthropic or artistic or fashion. A psycho god made me that is saying that divine influence is to blame for his actions, but also his personality, that he isn't brash or acts on impulse because he wants to, but because his supposed destiny is to. Rick Ross has performed Devil is a Lie on Jimmy Fallon before, which is a song about how ultimately God is great, and also is a reference back to Mac's biblical point about how he is a byproduct of God's will. The main sample is by Alan G, who composed the soundtrack for the 1973 French sci-fi film Fantastic Planet, a social commentary piece about how humans are living on a strange planet dominated by giant humanoid aliens who consider them animals. The intro to this track might be a subtle jab at his haters for whatever reason. He's asking Rhetoric to find answers to why people want him to die, whether musically or literally. In verse 1, he refers to Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, who was a hip-hop group in the early 90s led by none other than Mark Wahlberg himself, and also had Scott Ross, Hector Barros, Terry Yancey and Anthony Thomas. The famous song Good Vibrations that Mac references here went number 1 in the 1991 Billboard Hot 100. Got my head underwater is a worrying line, stating his drug use is causing him to physically and likely mentally drown too. The line in verse 2 talks about how the 1950s was an era when journalism was at its peak, which is talking about how back then people read things because they wanted to, not because they read some review that said it was good and therefore started to read. The journalism references could also be talking about his at the time girlfriend Nomi, who was a journalist. Ninth Wonder, the main man himself, produced track 20 Rain. You can sort of hear it in his sampling style. If you don't already know him, he's worked with everyone including Nas, Jay-Z, Drake, Ollie Murs, Destiny's Child, etc. I implore you to also watch his timeless rhythm roulette piece if you haven't already. There's another philosophical rhetoric thrown in verse 1 by Vince when he asks, what's fate when a person don't deserve what he get? The thing about chance in life, that if everything in life is predetermined, it's already destined to happen, then who is the judge of what bad or good things happen to someone? How does God determine whether something good or bad happens to someone? I mean, in verse 1, his main question is using stray bullets and gang violence as an example, but it can definitely be extrapolated to life for sure. Verse 2 has a statement by Mac on how getting out of addiction is extremely difficult, if not impossible, with the line, running from my shadow. He likens it to a battle. The outro gives a shout out to Ninth Wonder, but also talks about rain rhyming with pain. Accurate because rain often symbolizes sadness or despair. An apparition is a phantom or a ghost. It could symbolize that Mac has been spiritually killed and only exists as a phantom of his former self. Because of this, the line in verse 1, my studio is filled with spirits, makes sense. Now, as a ghost himself, he's able to see all his friends who have passed away. Ruben Eli Mitrani, his close friend, died unexpectedly from a brain hemorrhage, for example. The chorus is essentially proof that he'll never end his drug habits now that he's spiritually passed. Never got the steps right could be talking about how he's never managed to find his way to freeing his addiction. Verse 2 is more of a braggadocious piece, the rap chancellor being a position of power. He references DJ Clockwork, who's his DJ for live shows, the double meaning sort of referencing how, despite being named after Clockwork, the group as a whole, I guess, is unable to notice time passing, either due to drug use or just plain old having a good time. Track 22, Thumbalina, samples Slow Ride by the Beastie Boys, which in itself was quite a brag rap song. In the intro, note how Remember Music, aka Mac's record label, started in 2013, is mentioned. He started it after Ruben's death, as we mentioned earlier. Time is referenced here again in verse 1, whereby he talks about how he's time travelling, more like losing grip of reality and not knowing where he is exactly. Verse 2 then again mentions her faces, aka Thumbalina, who was a children's book character that time travelled and met many lovers who wanted to marry her. In this sense, Mac is sort of saying the character Thumbalina is blinded by all her options as she time travels. The person who sees the many faces of Thumbalina may be talking about how they each see a different version of her as she time travels. When Tebe mentions that line about Sid, he's talking about how everyone in Odd Future is family to him. This was back in 2014, keep in mind, when the crew, as he says, was on the cusp of money. He has had a line where he talks about how his skin is toughened over time, but also how he's grown as an individual, being more articulate in his music, but also more charismatic over time. A sense of self-growth, if you will. Verse 2 by Dash mentions Viggo Carpathian, the antagonist in Ghostbusters 2, who was a 16th century medieval sorcerer that came back as a ghost for revenge for his untimely death. A potential way of Dash saying how being under the influence heightens his own emotions, namely anger. Verse 3 by Mac talks about how religion to him personally has quite a deep impact, and that the wider meanings of religion to him are extremely useful even if he disagrees with religion itself. This may explain the large number of biblical and religious references in Faces. The intro for track 24 is from the semi-biographical film Where the Buffalo Roam, where Bill Murray plays the author Hunter S. Thompson, whereby he sort of stares at his own breakdown. In verse 1, Mac talks about being lost because he doesn't know what to do with himself. At the same time, he's willing to learn from others, such as meditation from music mogul Rick Rubin himself. Perhaps that's the only peace he's actually able to find despite having everything else he's ever wanted. Verse 2 starts off with another biblical reference with his lack of fear for evil, and then he talks about how human existence is similar to a dog's soul and bowl. Essentially, how we are innocent in our birth, but that as we grow and become accustomed to the ways of the world, we become devils in the desire for our own ego, examples being job promotions, or wanting a house and taking up land, or being a consumer of goods that are unethically made. His line on how even God one day will be forgotten is a line about how religion to him is an outdated construct, and that in times of higher knowledge will be replaced by something else. If you remember my previous mentions of how he views religion, note how he still treats religion as being important because of its many references. He just doesn't agree probably with how it's constructed or presented. Overall, Faces then is a very long mixtape. He speaks of his success, his relatability to people, his addictions getting in the way of himself, but also how addictions are making him bring out his nihilistic side and the truth about the world. To him, it's what's the point in living if I've got everything I need, and also if there's no point in trying to succeed in a society which in itself is broken. He still tried though to help by his own fund and through many of his selfless acts, and that's the lesson to take away. Even if you don't believe in the world, it's still a good thing to try and make it a better place for other people. If you never knew much about the person that Mac was, this is an excellent starting point. Pay attention to the honesty and really you'll come out a different person yourself, for sure.